time. I sent out the link to this class, and the link will have the lecture, the recorded lecture, and the PowerPoint, and whatever handouts we give out. So I want to have your email for that. And the questions, just kind of know what you're interested in. That will help guide me in preparing the classes based on that. So with that, we're going to jump in, okay? So today we're talking about the foundations of Jewish belief, okay? And this first class and the second class are a little bit theoretical. Most of our course will not be. Meaning, most of our course will be around customs and why we do things and how we do them. But this is important. This is the basics, and I started from the beginning because we're bringing this in the beginning because these are the foundations of Jewish belief. And we're addressing basically what Jews believe. Okay, that's the topic. And Maimonides famously wrote he put together 13 principles of Jewish faith. Anybody heard of that before? Yes, some of you may have heard about that. You're not going to hear about that today, okay? I'm not talking about that because it takes too long, okay? But what I did do is I organized the class based on that, okay? And so we are going to be talking about the three topics that he talks about in his 13 principles of Jewish faith. I'll add that, the 13 principles of faith, I'll put it in the folder for this, so you'll have that, okay? So we're going to talk about three topics. Number one, God, Torah, and the afterlife. And Maimonides discusses this in the following manner. He talks about God. He has maybe 6 or 7 of the principles are based on that. Then he talks about the Torah. He talks about Moses' prophecy, how it was unique, and that's to strengthen our belief in the validity of the Torah. And he talks about authorship of the Torah. So we're going to talk about that today, okay? And then he talks about reward and punishment. I coined that the afterlife, okay? And we're going to go a little bit into that topic. So I'm just going to tell you what we're going to go through. So God, and we're going to talk about God's one. These are 3 attributes of God that we're going to discuss. In terms of the Torah, I just want you to know when you get out of this class, and this is what I do in my high school class, every time, this is my second year teaching in the high school, so I always make sure that they know that there are 24 books in the Jewish Bible and what they are. And I also strive for them to know how to find things. Maybe that's for like another course. But I want you to know if you leave this course, you know that there's 24 books and what the different sections are. I'll feel really good about that. So hopefully, I think you'll be able to glean that today. Now, this is an important piece. We're going to talk about what happened at Sinai. Okay? And so there are some misconceptions around this, even amongst Orthodox people on their own Orthodox beliefs. So we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about the divide between different denominations on that front also, because that's a central divide. If you believe that Torah is from God, or if you believe human beings wrote it. And what does that mean? And lastly, afterlife. So there's some misconceptions about that, and I'm going to talk to you about my own journey with belief in the afterlife. Hopefully we'll get to that. And basically I worked once, before I came to Beth Tfiloh, I worked as a chaplain in a hospice unit for a full summer. That was a pretty uplifting summer. That was a tough summer. So, but I was around death a lot there, and it really, sometimes I would sit next to bodies and be there until they came to take care of them, and so I had a lot of time to think, and that was I know what the Jewish texts say, and that's what we're going to review here. But I'm going to tell you how I grapple with it and what I came to in my own journey. So that's kind of like the general structure of where we're going to go. Okay, so God, and just so you know, for your notes, each topic has a number. So God's number 1, Torah's number 2, Afterlife's number 3, and then each one has subtopics A, B, C. So if you like to take those, I like to take those nerdy type notes, or all organized and so. If you like to do that too, this will make you feel good. If you don't, then don't pay attention to it. Okay, so the first time we're going to talk about, first aspect about God is that God is one. Okay, is this prayer familiar to? Yes. Okay, so this is the Shema prayer. Okay, in this Shema prayer we say, Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad, and this is where we confirm that God is one. So my question for you is, what does that mean? Just feel free. What does it mean? First of all, let me point out 2 things. Number 1, the Shema is a central prayer, right? It's considered maybe top 3 prayers, maybe the top prayer in all of Judaism. So obviously it's important. Okay? And obviously the contents are important. So the statement is that God is one. There's a few statements in there. God is our God, the Lord is one. But the idea of God's oneness is a really important thing. So with that in mind, what do you think we're trying to think about when we say that prayer? What do you want to say?
It's monotheistic belief.
Can't
Only
hear
one
you.
God. There's only one God. There's
Monotheistic belief. The idea that there's only one God and not what? Not multiple gods, right?
Yeah, guess what?
Any other thoughts on that? On the Shem Echad?
He's universal. He's,
Keep going with it.
everywhere,
Uh-huh.
present, omnipresent.
Okay, so that's good. So this is the
Supreme being.
supreme being, meaning he's one above all. Awesome, yeah. So those are all intentions that people offer in different texts. We're going to go through 2 different streams of thought on this front, and they're going to connect to what both of you said. Okay. Here's another thing. When I was studying Jewish philosophy at Bar-Ilan University, I like these like letters and numbers. I also like charts. Okay. So I'm going to show you one part of a chart that was really much more expansive, but I spared you all that. I brought you the basics that I think you might want to know. Okay. So there are like a few other on each side of this whole chart, and this is this chart helped me. Okay, when I saw this. Okay, this flow chart. So the first, so we're talking about God as one. So the first belief that Judaism is trying to combat is the idea that there are multiple gods. Okay, and that's polytheism. Poly means multiple, theism is God. Mm-hmm. So the idea that the Kriyat Shema, we're basically saying God is the only source of everything that happens. And this is a relevant prayer in general, just when we say this, someone says this people say this when they die, and that you say this throughout every day in your life. And the idea is that we want to recognize there's a lot of forces in the world, right? There are you're driving to work, and this person cuts you off, and that person beeps at you, and you're on the phone, and your spouse does something that bothers you. All these things going on around us, and the Kriyat Shema is basically saying that there's all these forces, but in the end, the belief is that God is the source of what happens in our lives, or at least God is overseeing all these forces. God is the supreme force behind everything that's going on. And the basic belief is that we turn to God and not to other things for our help. That's like the simple explanation of that. Instead of putting our faith in magicians or medication, we put our faith in maybe in medication too, but also in the end, also in God. So that's kind of like the idea that God is the source. Okay. So that's one approach, and that's the biblical monotheism. Okay, that's what the Torah is really trying to get at, to say that there are a lot of forces, but in the end, God's behind everything. Now, another approach that's offered, and this is like more of a complicated name. Okay, if we get through this, it'll be smooth sailing afterwards, in the sense that like this looks a little like scary, but this is like the only heavy philosophical part. Okay, so bear with me as we go through this. Okay. The second approach that I want to introduce to you is another approach, and this is more of a mystical approach. And this approach is called panentheism. Okay, pantheism is the idea that the whole world is God. That's pantheism. Panentheism is that God encompasses the world. This is kind of like, you could picture it like kind of like a womb. Okay, and God, the world. So,
Is this a conversion class?
yeah. Alright. So this approach basically says that God is everywhere, and the whole world is encompassed in God. But God is still beyond the world. Meaning God's not limited to this world. The world, this table, our lives, things that happen to us, God's involved in them. God's incorporated in them. But in the end, God is so much more than that. Okay, so the main thing about these two approaches that I want to highlight to you, okay, is that both of them talk about God being involved in the world. This has an arrow. God's involved with the world. But God is still, according to this approach, God is above and beyond the world. This approach is God is immanent, God is involved, engaged in our daily affairs, God is everywhere, but still, God is not limited to this world. And so both of these models have the same two principles that we're going to talk about in this whole topic of God. The idea that, on one hand, God is involved in our lives. God is close to us, okay? In this model, God's in heaven as if, this is the biblical model. God comes down and sees what happens in Sodom and Gomorrah. Why? Because God's above. So this approach is that God's above, and most of us kind of sometimes experience our lives like this, where we pray to God and we hope that God will help us from heaven or in some way or another. But God's still involved and helps out and engages in daily affairs. This approach says that God's still beyond the world. The world's encompassed in God, but God is much more than that. But the world is encompassed within God, meaning everything that happens, everything that goes on, everything that's alive. This has atoms in it. Everything around God is in everything. And so really, both of these approaches say that God's distant, but God's close. This approach says that God's more distant, right? God's above, involved in our friend. This approach says God's in everything. And so you mentioned, which approach did you mention? You mentioned that God's universal, omnipresent. That would be more like this approach. And you mentioned that God is, what did you say?
A monotheism, I was just saying, it's a monotheistic religion.
That would be this approach more in the sense that God is above, kind of engaging and changing our worldly affairs. Okay, so I wanted you to get to know those two approaches. Okay, and those really influence your spiritual experience. So I'll give you an example. Okay, so there's a discussion of why bad things happen to good people. Okay, that's been I've been talking about in the shul a lot recently since in school. Actually, I was asked to give a talk on it in one of the high school classes, and there are different approaches as to why bad things happen to Jewish people and Jewish thought. The famous book, anybody ever read that book? Why Bad Things? So who's the author? I think it's Kushner.
Yeah.
So if you go on Amazon, you go top 10 Jewish books. One of the top 10 Jewish books sold on Amazon is Why Bad Things Happen to Good People. And it's Harold Kushner, and his child became very sick, and he started asking himself, like, I have all this stuff in my tradition that I'm supposed to believe. In the end, how do I know? I want to know for myself. I want to investigate, why do these bad things happen to my child? And so his approach was basically that God is kind of detached from the world. That was his answer. God's detached from the world. Bad happens. God maybe pains over it, or God's upset about it. God's equally as upset about it as we are. But God doesn't engage on a daily basis. And that's how bad things can happen in the world. Now, a lot of people critique this book because they feel like that doesn't answer the question. That just says that you just demoted God, and you said that God can't help out what's going on in the world. But that approach is connected to this line of thinking. That God is above, and God sometimes intervenes with what's going on, but a lot of the time God kind of does what God does, whatever that is. Okay? Now, but there are other approaches to that question of why bad things happen to good people, and they'll say that everything happens in this world is from God. We just have to understand maybe why it's good. It could be to teach you a lesson. It could be to strengthen your faith in God. It could be multiple reasons. And that approach more connects to this view of God. God's in everything. Everything that happens is from God. God's not above, sitting and just watching what's going on. God's incorporated. God's engaged. Everything. If you meet somebody on the street and they tell you something nice, and you were sad that morning, that's from God, right? Or something happens, you turn the wrong way on the street, and you end up somewhere where you didn't think you're supposed to go, and that ends up being an amazing thing for you. That's God intervening in your life, because God is in everything. And and it can get taken to really extreme places. The Baal Shem Tov says that even a leaf that falls from a tree, the Midrash says it, a leaf that falls from a tree is commanded by God to fall. Okay, so you can go either extreme. You can say God's completely in heaven, or everything that happens is from God. But really, these are the two. Really, it's like the pendulum of Jewish thought. Either God's in everything, or God's above. But all approaches in traditional Jewish thought hold that God's involved in one way or another. Maybe from above, maybe from inside. Okay, so I just wanted to show you that the idea that God's involved, God is one, and this idea that God is one can either say that God's very involved or God's distant. And these two aspects of distance and closeness is kind of what we're going to talk about right now. Yeah.
So are you saying that both approaches are...
Both are monotheistic.
They're both accepted in Judaism?
Yes, exactly. That's what I want to show. If you wrote a line here, and you said there's the world and there's God, that would be deism. That there's two different beings and they're not connected. But all traditional Jewish texts that I'm familiar with want to say that God's involved in some way or another. Maybe distant, maybe from above, maybe comes down every once in a while. If you read the Bible, God's talking to Abraham, or God's involved in Egypt, okay? So that's the idea that God's involved. But the question is how much? And this is the spectrum of thought. The extremes would be that there's only a world and no God, right? Or over here that God's above and God doesn't connect at all to the world. So this is the spectrum of like kosher or traditional views that are incorporated in Jewish texts, and there's like in between. It's like a spectrum. Okay, so that's kind of like the two approaches. Okay, so I want to talk about those two pieces of God being close and then God being distant, and that's what we're going to talk about in these next two pieces. Okay, and this is a really important thing. If you ever who's familiar with this tune? Please don't make me sing it. So, or you familiar with that? So that's the melody that's sung to the Kiddush on Friday night. When we bring in the Sabbath, we bless over a cup of wine, and we sing verses. In those verses, if you pay close attention, it talks about commemorating the Exodus from Egypt. Okay? And Egypt is all over the place in Judaism. Pesach, obviously, right? But everywhere you go, it pops up. And the question is, why is Egypt so central? Even it pops up in our Kiddush on Friday nights. It's all over the Zecher, Litziyah, Mitzrayim. Mitzrayim is Egypt. And so the reason why it's so central is Egypt, the Exodus from Egypt for the Jewish tradition, at least how I understand it, how I've learned it, really highlights the idea that God's involved in our lives. Okay, so it's not just something that happened when you're sitting at your Seder and your Pesach and you're eating all the matzah and the matzah balls and all the charoset and all that stuff. The idea is that we're really ideally, we're supposed to be really connecting to that value of God being able to help us in our lives. Just like God helped Am Yisrael in Egypt so long ago in a very difficult situation, God can help us today. And that's really highlighting the idea that God is close, okay, and that God is the God of history. That's a central thing that's important to know. And there's a book that came out, Rabbi Yehuda Levi put out a book. He's a medieval thinker, and he says it's a mistake when you start to present somebody, talk about Judaism, the philosophers will start talking about God creating the world, right? The work of creation, that God created the world. He says we don't start from that place. We don't talk about God. We first introduce God to somebody. We don't talk about how God created the world. We talk about something different. We talk about how God freed us from Egypt. Because if you say God created the world, God could create the world and then just leave it. So when we talk about God removing Am Yisrael from Egypt, the idea is that God can be involved and help us in our daily affairs. That's kind of an important piece that I wanted to highlight with Egypt. Any thoughts on that, or just kind of questions? All right, cool. Now, this idea that God's close, this would be like B2, not B1, B2. Anyway, this idea that God's close, this is a really important thing. God's not just close, okay? And this is the majority of Jewish texts that I've seen. When I'm saying that, I'm saying I guess over the last thousands of years, okay? Talmud, medieval thinking, up to most modern thought, want to say that God's a personal God. Okay? And what does that mean? That means that when we're going through stuff, we can turn to God and pray to God. Now, we're going to talk about this when we get to prayer. Doesn't necessarily mean that God's going to answer everything that we ask for, right? But we are, for the most part, told that, and hopefully we experience in our personal lives, that God is someone we can turn to. It's in the prayer, in the Shemona Esrei, and the daily prayers, we talk about God as hearing our prayers, Shomea Tfilah, right? It doesn't say that God answers our prayers, but God hears our prayers. And that's a really important piece in Jewish thought, is that you can turn to God. God's a personal God. God's involved. And there's a thinker. Anybody heard of Abraham Joshua Heschel? Anybody ever heard of him before? So he's anybody? Okay. So he was an important rabbi at the Jewish Theological Seminary in the conservative movement, and he wrote a book called God in Search of Man. It's a pretty cool book in the sense that, like, he says that God's in search of the connection with us. It's not just us in search of connection with God. God's in search of the connection with us. And he brings all kinds of stories from the Bible that show that God's seeking out that connection. So it's not just that God's involved with our affairs. God's seeking out a connection according to him, or at least God's someone we can always turn to and in our time of need. And the whole book of Psalms really is about that, turning to God in prayer. That's one of the books of the Tanakh that we'll see in a moment. So our Shmonai, so our daily prayers, when we do the silent devotion part of our daily prayers, it starts like this: Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu Elokei Avotenu Elohei Abraham Elohei Yitzchak Elohei Yaakov. And it starts like, blessed are you, Hashem, our God and the God of our ancestors. And so this is a really important piece. The idea that our ancestors, that's Egypt, okay? But it's also our God. And the whole, really the big project of Judaism has been, for me, since I started, for the last 20 years, is trying to find my God. Okay, so there's many sides to God. In Jewish texts talk about that, and all of us have different avenues through which we connect to God. And really, the ideal thing is try to find our God. How do we understand God? How can I connect to God? Is it through my mind? Is it through my intellect? Is it through my emotions? Through a spiritual experience? All of us have our own ways of connecting to God, and it's really an important thing as you embark on, if you're interested in continuing on the journey into Jewish texts, is to try to really feel what space is comfortable for you in spirituality, connecting to God, and there could be multiple, but it's a really important thing. So those are a few pieces on the idea that God's one, and that God's close to us, and the idea that we start from Egypt, and that's why it's so central, and the idea that we all have to find our own personal connection to God. And I just say another thing, like, there are so many texts that can guide you in finding your connection. If you're more of like a rational type person, you can go through Maimonides. If you're more of a mystic, you can go through Jewish mysticism. If you like meditation, you can go through Hasidism. And there's so many different paths and ways, so it's really important to kind of know who you are and try to find your God based on it. Yeah.
Does this tie in with the fact that we can pray ourselves to God? We don't need an intermediary.
That's awesome. Yeah, it does. It really does. We have, the Bible's filled with everyone have a question? Right. So the Bible's filled with discussions with God, right? Between the forefathers and foremothers. They're talking directly with God, and that's a really big piece. We don't have an intermediary in Judaism. We have rabbis who sometimes thinks that they're the intermediary, but that's not really a tenet of Jewish faith, right? You can go straight to God. We're going to talk about this when we get to Jewish prayer part. It's like, I think it's class. I don't know what class it is, but Rabbi Nachman of Breslov says that you should talk to God like you talk to a friend. There's texts like that. He says you should try to find a silent place to do it in the woods, or if you can't find a place to do it, you can do it under your covers, and you can talk to God like you talk to a friend. And so that's kind of really talking to your point that God is accessible. And you're not always going to get the answers that you want. But God's always someone you can turn to on a direct level. Yeah.
Do you talk to God out loud, or do you talk to him just in your mind?
Yeah, so Rabbi Nachman of Breslov, he's a Hasidic master from the 18th century. He talks about verbalizing it. Yeah, verbalizing it to God. Yeah. I'll show you how to do it. God, please help us learn everything that we need to do in this class and have a good experience. Right? That's an example of that, okay? But it could be in your mind too. You can meditate. There are multiple ways to connect to God. We'll talk about that when we get to prayer. Okay, so here's another piece. Okay, these are three pieces. God is one. God is what was it? Testing you. God is close. Okay, and God is unique. Okay. So first things first. God is infinite. Okay, that's a general belief that we believe that God has been around, God will be around, and all the other omnis that go with that. God is benevolent, omnipotent, omniscient. We're not going to get into all that, but that God is what the belief that God has been around and will be around, and that will connect to our discussion of the soul. If our souls are godly, maybe they'll still be around too, hopefully. So it'll be connected to that. I don't want to touch on that as much, but I do want to touch on these last two pieces and then show this little skit here. So, God does, this is an important thing. Maimonides bring this in the 13 Principles of Faith. God does not have a human body. Okay, so the closest to incarnation, which is the idea that God is incarnated in physicality, that Judaism has, I would say probably would be like the nation of Israel or the humanity. That God, or in the holy people, God can be, according to Jewish texts, God is present in holy people or in Am Yisrael or in the world, but it doesn't mean that being equals God. Okay, God can be present, but it's not. It doesn't mean that the spiritual leader is God, and that's where Judaism takes issue with like classic like Christian thinking, in the sense that we don't believe in Jesus being a God. He could have been a knowledgeable or a very charismatic and spiritual rabbi at the time, and there could be what to learn. I believe that there is, but I've read the good parts of the New Testament. I think there's what to learn there, and I think there's what Judaism has to learn from other religions too. But we don't believe that any human being is or will be a god. Even Moses died. Okay, Moses is considered the holiest person in Jewish tradition. He died, and everybody dies. Sorry, guys. No, but and that's the end of the class. No, just kidding. But so okay, so but the idea is that and nobody's perfect, right? Moses sins in the Torah. All of the characters in the Jewish Torah, in the Torah. All right, all the characters in the Torah sin, and that's an important thing. There's no infallible characters, okay? Because only God, we want to believe that God is the only one that's perfect. And the last piece, okay, is God a He, okay? So on a deep what?
I said yes.
Okay. Anybody say no?
I say no.
All right, anybody say maybe? Anybody awake? No, just joking. No. So
He doesn't have gender.
yeah. So on the deepest level, so prayer. If you go through if you go into the synagogue, okay, you go around the corner, you open up the prayer book, you'll see it's talking that God as a He, right? God, blessed are you, O Lord our God. So that doesn't. But there's a lot of God, the Holy One, blessed be He. Okay, and there's a lot of Him, He's. But on the deepest level, God is beyond human categories. They're categories we've given to God. Because if you believe that God's infinite and God's beyond our categories of understanding, a lot of these ways are our ways of our categories that we've applied to God. And then when I was in yeshiva, one of my rabbis, we had an experiment where we envisioned what it would look like to talk to God as she. And there's a name for a feminine name for God in Kabbalah. It's called the Shekhinah. That's a feminine name. And there are expressions of feminine side of God. There's discussions of that in Jewish mysticism. I'm just trying to say that if you really want to go with the idea that God is unique and different than humans, if you want to go with it all the way, you would say that God is neither gender. Mm-hmm. But traditionally, God's been referred to as a He, and that's what happens in a lot of Orthodox circles. But I know other denominations they've incorporated other types of language. So that's the idea that God's unique. Okay, I just want to show you this really quickly. This is a little piece about God.
See you here.
Anybody know what this movie is?
Yeah, man, that's cool. About me, Bruce.
Bruce Almighty.
Okay, this is Bruce Almighty. Okay, so Jim Carrey. Okay, Morgan Freeman. Morgan Freeman is God in this movie. Okay, and Jim Carrey says, "God, what are you doing? You're not running things the right way." He goes, "Okay, why don't you try it?" Okay, and so Jim Carrey at this point is going to get the powers from God. Okay.
You've been doing a lot of complaining about me, Bruce.
You hear it?
Quite frankly, I'm tired of it.
Wait. Don't come near me, seriously. When I'm backed into a corner like a wild animal, I don't want to hurt you, but I will out of instinct.
You haven't won a fight since grade 5, and that was against a girl.
Yeah, she was huge. She'd been held back.
And the sun was in your eyes. Oh, the ego. Anyway, I brought you here to offer you a job.
Job? What job?
My job. You think you can do it better, so here's your chance. When you leave this building, you will be endowed with all my powers.
Whatever you say, Bill. Okay.
So this goes on.
No one needs to hear about it. I'm done.
Having fun?
Thou.
God, no. All right. So I wanted to show you this too, just the idea that this would not like fly with the traditional Jewish. Now there are such things as miracle workers. Okay, the Talmud's filled with it. I've been around people. I even had like relatives, like a few generations ago, who were involved in like Jewish magic and stuff like that. So in Israel. So there is something like that, but we will never say that the person himself or herself is God. Okay, that's like a central thing. Neither Morgan Freeman or Jim Carrey, no matter how funny or good they are
But
in
Morgan
acting.
Freeman's voice, that's God.
That is God, man. You're right. You're right. Shawshank Redemption is one of my favorite movies. All right. So, 1 second. Okay. So that's kind of like, so that sums up the God part, okay? We talked about the three aspects, and what I really want you to know is that Judaism is constantly grappling between those two aspects. On one hand, God is close. On one hand, God is unique. And that's the whole Jewish experience, that we always want to draw close to God, but we always want to retain that distance, okay? And if you draw God too close, then you're on the border, you're on the boundary of idol worshiping. If you draw God too close, you might turn God into a human into God, or an idol into God, because you want to be so close to God. If you distance God to be all the way in heaven, so you're on the boundary of maybe being atheistic or very distant from a traditional understanding of a personal God. So that's kind of like the tension that Judaism is always in, and you'll find it all over the place in the Jewish spiritual experience. Closeness and distance, uniqueness and integration. So those are kind of the two sides. Okay, we're going to move on to Torah. Okay, and if you have questions, please write them down, and I can address them. I'll give some time after each section. Right now, we're going to move on, but write them down. You can either address and come to me after class, or send them to me. Okay, I'm pretty good. I answer emails quickly. Okay, and I'm available for you. Okay, so just know that. All right. So here, we're going to move on. We finished the God piece. It took us only 20, 25 minutes to talk about God. I think we did a good job, no?
Yes.
All right. So everything you need to know about God in 25 minutes. Now I want to teach you everything you need to know about the Torah in 15 minutes. So I want to save some time for the afterlife. And that, if you get through this, you might end up there. No, I was joking. But, okay, so this is important. This is really important. Okay, I wanted to give you a handout of this, but I didn't do that. But maybe I'll attach that in the folder. Okay, also. Okay. This is the Old Testament. This is the Bible. This is the Jewish Bible, and it's made up of 24 books. Okay, so when someone says, when you read the Torah in the synagogue, okay, the Sefer Torah. Everybody familiar with the Torah scroll that's read in synagogue? Yeah. What you're reading is not the blue and not the pink or the tan. You're reading the orange. Those are the first 5 books these are called the 5 books of Moses. It's also called the Chumash. It's also called the Torah. Okay, and this basically spans around 2,500 years or so, from Torah's creation, Genesis, all the way till Moses' death. at the end of Deuteronomy. And it ends at a cliffhanger. Okay, the Jews are waiting to get into the land of Israel, and they end up not ever getting in. And I once gave a talk on that, like why there's no happy ending to the Torah, but that's for like another time. But the book, the next piece of the Bible is called the Prophets. Okay, and in this book you have, ever heard of Elijah the prophet? You have the stories of Elijah the prophet. You have the stories of Samuel. King David, you heard of him?
Yeah.
King David can be found in Samuel and Kings. You have the story of Saul and the baby. Remember that story, the judgment, Solomon. Sorry, those stories appear there. You have the book of Joshua. It's when the Jews first conquered the land of Israel after Moses died. So these are stories of the prophets. And in the history class next week, you will get more exposure to when these things happen. Okay, we're not in history right now. Okay, so you will get more exposure and understanding of when they happen. The third part of the Tanakh, okay, and let me just show you. I have a Tanakh here. This is a Tanakh, okay? So up to here, around here, is the Torah. That's the Torah. The 5 books of Moses, the orange part. See? And this part's the prophets. So this goes probably until around here, okay? Halfway through. These are the next, however many, 8 books, okay? And then last piece of the Jewish Bible is the writings, the Ketuvim. And in here, there's some really amazing stuff. Okay, this is like, my personal opinion, but I really love this stuff. So you have the Psalms, and those are a book of like around 150 prayers that, according to tradition, King David recited and recorded. You have the book of Proverbs, which is like really interesting wisdom teachings. You have the book of Job, which is a story about the problem of evil. Why do bad things happen to good people? There's the Song of Songs, which is a love story. You have the book of Ruth, the story of conversion. You have Lamentations, which is a story of mourning over the temple. So there's some amazing things in this piece. And this is more like wisdom literature. Okay, so this book is the story of the history of the nation of Israel and the creation of the world. This piece is more the story of the nation of Israel, like in the land of Israel, with the prophets and prophecies. This is more like wisdom literature. I just kind of want to familiarize you with those 3 bodies of work. And another important thing to take away is this. The word Tanakh, okay? This is called a Tanakh in Hebrew, okay? That is an acronym for Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim. So it's Tanakh. That's why it's called Tanakh. So that's a good thing to know. Yeah. So I always ask my high school students that on like one of the first tests I give them. So I don't want them to leave Beth Tfiloh not knowing that. That's like, and I want you guys to leave here not knowing that either. Okay. So you have Torah, Nevi'im, and Ketuvim. Okay. So that's the Tanakh, and this is what's referred to in Christianity as the Old Testament, in their Christian canon as the Old Testament. They have what they call the New Testament, which is books that come afterwards. But all 24 of these books are included in what they call the Old Testament. So that's kind of what's referred to in our culture. Okay, that's like a little bit on the 3 sections of the Bible. Okay, it's also referred to as the Bible. All right, here's a quiz because I know it's a little bit late. Here's a question for you, okay? And tell me which one you think's right. A few options. There are gonna be 5 options, okay? For 613 mitzvah points, okay? There happen to be 613 commandments, okay? So I wanted to say something like, what's that show? The points don't matter. What was that show? Whose line is it anyway? Anyway, so for 613 points, although the points don't matter. Based on traditional text, which is the correct answer? Okay, so what happened at Mount Sinai? Yeah.
The Torah was given to Moses, written Torah, and it was passed on to the Jewish people.
Awesome. Okay, so we're going to see. We're going to define that in an even more nuanced way. Okay. Traditionally, Mount Sinai. Mount Sinai is a mountain outside of Israel, in Sinai Peninsula, Egypt. And when the Jews left Egypt, according to Jewish tradition, around 49 days later, they had a spiritual experience with God at Mount Sinai. And according to Jewish tradition, they received the Torah at Sinai. And so there's a statement like that, Moses received the Torah from Sinai. Now the question is, two questions. Number one, the first question is, what did the Jews or Moses receive at Sinai? What does that mean exactly? I mean, we have, if you go to any library, you have thousands and thousands of books. Those didn't fall down from heaven at Sinai. Some of them were written by, we have a book by Rabbi Wahlberg called, that didn't fall from Sinai. Maybe some people think it did, but yeah.
So basically there's the written law, or written Torah and oral Torah, and the oral Torah is basically Talmud and all the other stuff.
Yeah, so we're going to touch on that right now. Okay, so that's the first question. The second question is, what did different denominations in Judaism hold with regard to who wrote the Torah? Was it God? Was it Moses? Was it human beings over the generations? So I'm going to present you the Orthodox view, but I'm also going to present you what the other denominations say. Okay, so here are the options. I was pretty proud of myself. I was able to do that, tap it, and then it took a while, okay? All right, so here are the options, okay? For 613 mitzvah points, which one is correct? At Mount Sinai, Moses received all of Tanakh. That's the first one. All right, so can everyone together say no for that? No, good. Why? Because all those stories that we saw in the last happened after the Torah. I'm just trying to get back. Okay. Okay. Let's go back. Yeah. So all this stuff happened after Sinai. Because Sinai happened here. In Exodus. Okay? So obviously that wasn't given at Sinai, all that other stuff. Alright.
Scene here. Or a hollow spot.
Alright, we're back. Okay, another option would be all of the written Torah.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, okay. We have some yeses, okay. All of the written Torah until that point. Meaning, Torah was given a third way through, 30%, 3/10 of the way through this book. So, all the stuff beforehand, that's an option. Maybe all that stuff that happened beforehand, the creation of the world, the flood, all the Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Sarah, Rachel, and Leah. That's another option. Another option would be that the 10 Commandments were given at Sinai. And another one would be that 10 Commandments and oral traditions are given at Sinai. So just, if you think the answer is A, raise your hand. Okay, good. If you think the answer is B, raise your hand. Okay, it's okay if you get it. If you think the answer is C, raise your hand. All right. D? All right. E? All right. So the answer is E. Okay. So that's the answer based on Jewish texts, and I'll explain what I mean by that. Okay. There are a few stages. Okay, we're going to get through this in kind of like a abridged manner, but there are a few stages, and I'm just going to give you the bullet points here. Okay, there are a few stages to the writing of the Torah. I'm giving you the traditional, the Orthodox view. Okay, so the first stage of the writing of the Torah was at Sinai, which happened in the middle of the second book. Moses wrote down what happened beforehand, based on what God told him to write down. That would be the traditional view. So he had a scroll, and the Bible talks about how at Sinai he read to the nation the scroll. So the question is, what scroll? Everything that happened beforehand that he wrote down. So the stories of the flood, the creation of the world, Abraham, Isaac, and all of that supposedly he wrote down right before the Sinai experience, which is in the middle of Exodus. Then in Exodus, a little bit in, the Sinai experience happens. What happens there? Moses is on the mountain for 40 days. We receive the 10 Commandments. And the nation hears some of those 10 Commandments. Moses hears all of them. And after 40 days, this is like the leap of faith. Moses received the Ten Commandments from God. So you can't prove that happened. That's a certain leap of faith. But there's a belief that God gave the Ten Commandments. However that happened, I don't know. And then afterwards, this is the book. And another thing that happened at Sinai was Moses received oral traditions from God, and that's a really important thing. Okay, when we say that Moses received the Torah from God at Sinai, the belief is you received the Ten Commandments, but more importantly, you received all of the a huge swath of oral traditions, and those oral traditions were explanations for the rest of all the different intricate laws. And so that's a really important thing. When we say Moses received the Torah at Sinai, he received the oral tradition at Sinai. We have to define, when we talk about Jewish law, we'll define what oral tradition is, okay? But for now, just say it in general. And then a third stage of writing down the Torah happened at the end of the book of Deuteronomy. And at the end of the book, it says that Moses wrote down all the things that happened until then. Okay, one opinion says that he wrote down throughout the desert. From Exodus to here, to Deuteronomy, some other important thing. There's only 39 years. So really, 80% of the Torah really deals with only 40 years. Right? It's crazy, right? If you think about it. And no, I'll say even more. It only deals with really 3 years. The first 2 years in the desert and the last year. So all this stuff is only 3 years. That's a pretty interesting fact. Anyway, so some people say that Moses wrote down everything that happened in different scrolls and then put them all together at the end, or he wrote down it all at one shot. But the idea is that according to traditional texts, that he wrote it down based on what God told him to write down. And so those are the 3 stages of the writing of the Torah. You have the first stage is Moses wrote at Sinai, the traditions, the things that happened beforehand. Then you have Sinai experience itself as 10 Commandments and the oral traditions. And then afterwards was the rest of the Torah that Moses wrote down either through the experience here, and he put it together at the end based on what God told him, or at the very end that he wrote all that stuff based on what God told him. The most important piece here, though, according to in traditional, from a traditional perspective, is that he wrote what God told him. Okay, and Deuteronomy is kind of like his own speech to the nation, but it's in his own words. But still, Jewish traditional texts want to say that he still wrote down based on what God told him to write. Other denominations, Jewish denominations, first off, they would say that Moses could have written it without God telling him to do it, or more common was more adopting the academic view that if you go through the Torah, there are a lot of different languages. It seems like they might have been written. If you go deep into it, there's contradictions, and so academics want to say that they're written at different time periods by different authors. And the Torah is a composite of a lot of different authors writing a lot of different texts, and some later redactor, some scribe put them together, and that's what we have. But traditional texts don't ascribe to that. But more like modern Orthodox circles do grapple with it, and that's an interesting thing to see. How do you grapple with that? Because on one hand, modern Orthodox communities are in university learning scientific methods. On the other hand, they want to uphold their traditional beliefs, and so that's a topic for a whole other class. But other denominations in Judaism, like conservative and reform, that's kind of one of the points of where they break off. Is do you believe in the divine authorship of the Torah or not? If you believe in the divine authorship of the Torah, so I'm talking about 613 mitzvah points. We're also going to be talking about 613 mitzvah acts that one has to do because you believe that they're from God. If you don't believe that the Torah is written by God, it was written by humans, so these could be good recommendations or a good way of life, but it doesn't have that same authority. And so that's one of the reasons why some of the other denominations are less scrupulous with all the different details. I'm not saying that in a good or bad way. I'm just saying it objectively. It's because it's not necessarily divine. It comes from a human source, and so it doesn't have that same authority. And so that's kind of like one of the divides between the different denominations, including conservative Judaism. A lot of rabbis in conservative Judaism believe that the Torah was written by humans or different scribes at different time periods. Rabbi Wolpe is a big rabbi in the conservative movement, and he said that the story of Exodus never happened. Okay, and he was critiqued for it at the time, but he says, listen, we're all of us at our Jewish Theological Seminary, which is the conservative center for Jewish rabbis, all of us learned this stuff there, and I'm just saying what I learned. And so, yeah.
Do you think a lot of people get hung up and pick D because of like the Cecil B. Mill kind of Ten Commandments,
Yeah.
where they focus on pretty much the burning bush and
Yes.
the finger of God writing the Ten Commandments and then him coming down the mountain?
Yes, I think so. All right, let's talk about the afterlife, okay? That's a little bit on the Torah, like on one leg, as they say in the Talmud. Here's a little bit about the afterlife. I think there was another. How was that? Saw it spin. Do you want to see that again? Anyway, I was cool. I was like, whoa, it spins. All right, I figured like heaven and hell, it's like spinning. Anyway, so here what I'm going to do here is I'm going to front the traditional view, and then I'm going to share a little bit, just I guess briefly, of my own journey with this, or my grappling with. Do I believe? I know what Rabbi Yoga believes, because I know what the texts say, and I'm going to share that with you. But I want to know what Eli Yoga thinks. Do I believe that there is an afterlife? Do I really believe it? And that was like part of my journey that summer. So really quickly on this. So I was in an interfaith program with different rabbis and priests in training. We were all sitting in a circle, and the priests in training asked the rabbis in training questions, and the rabbis in training asked the priests in training. And one of the questions that the priests in training asked was, what does Judaism have to say about the end of days and the afterlife? And one of the rabbis in training stood up in our seminar, and he said, we don't have so much to say about the end of days and the afterlife. Your tradition's focused on this world and this life. And last class we talked about that. Judaism is really focused on this world. And that's where this misconception, afterwards I spoke for a while, and I said that I don't agree with that. And I think that's a misconception that he had, I think. And I think that's a general misconception. Now you could say, like, I don't ascribe to those texts, but there are a lot of texts, starting from the Talmud, starting from some texts maybe in the Bible, and going on more in the Talmud in later generations, which talk about what's going to happen in the end of days with Messiah and other things, and more importantly, that there is a heaven and a hell. There is something afterwards. There's an afterlife. Okay? So the misconception that Judaism doesn't believe in heaven and hell, I think, come from two places. Number one, the idea that Judaism is so this world focused that sometimes it's about fixing this world, making the world a better place, doing mitzvot, doing commandments, learning Torah. It's so focused on this world that sometimes we lose track of the thought that there is something after this world. But that doesn't mean that the texts don't talk about that. I think another source of that misconception is that the Bible, and this is an important thing, the Torah, the Tanakh, this book, wherever it got to, this book doesn't mention it that much. Okay, so that's something to think about. Okay, later texts do. This book maybe mentions it like on two hands. That many mentions of it, and so that's something really to think about. The heavy discussions on the afterlife start in the Talmud, and we'll talk about when that time period is. But it's like 1,000 years later, or later, and so those discussions start later. But from then on, and they refer to Tanakh. From then on, though, there's a lot of discussion on it. So I just want to share with you a little bit on what might happen according to a traditional approach, and then touch on that last. Okay, so and I want to deal with these two misconceptions, and then we'll talk about a little bit shortly about like my own experience. So another misconception is that in heaven and hell there are pitchforks and halos. So the way I've been taught what happens after we leave this world is not it's not a superficial thing where there's pitchforks and there's fire and there's halos or virgins or anything like that. But rather, the way I've been taught and the way I read it, and I'm sharing that with you, is that it's a spiritual experience. So first of all, there is a belief in it, and the question is, what is it? So it's a spiritual experience, and the soul, when the soul leaves the body, there are different stages. I just kind of like have them for myself here. There are different stages when the soul leaves the body. The first stage is right after death. Okay, so when the soul leaves the body after death, the soul is in a certain state of bliss. It's like a spiritual reality. We're going to discuss what the soul is too. Okay, but the soul is something spiritual. It's in a certain spiritual bliss, and that can be good or bad. It's good because that's what the soul wants. It wants to be around spirituality. It's bad because the soul's so used to being in a body that it's confused. And it's disoriented. And some people explain that as heaven and hell. The more somebody is involved with positive, spiritual, enlightening, good things in this world, they're going to feel more comfortable when they get to that place of good. The more they're engrossed in the body and selfish desires and egotistical drives, when they get to that world, they're going to feel very out of place and missing their body. And so that's one way I've heard that explained, the idea of heaven and hell, and based on where we are spiritually, that's how we will be experiencing the next world. I'm using the word spiritual in a broad sense. I'm not just saying Torah or mitzvah. It could be being a good person too, or being engaged in good things.
So when you're speaking of soul, you're talking about the divine soul.
Coming in?
Are you talking about the divine soul when you're talking about soul?
Yes.
The human soul?
Yeah, the divine soul. And so there's discussions. Then you have the first 7 days. It says this, in the Talmud. It says the soul is like mourning for itself, and so the soul is, and it says that the souls can hear what's going on in this world. The Talmud says. It says that in Shabbat, in the Talmud tractate Shabbat 152b, it says everything people say before the deceased knows. And it says it could even stretch until their flesh decomposes. That could be over a year. And when we say Kaddish in synagogue, when we pray for people's souls, the traditional belief is that you're praying for them to be elevated in heaven. And so the idea is that the soul there's still certain connection to the soul. There's still ability to influence the soul. Now, another important thing to know is about let's talk about hell for a moment. Another important thing to know is that Judaism, for the most part, does not believe in eternal damnation. Okay? It's an important thing. Hell, the experience of hell can stretch for up to like 12 months, but it's my rabbis, I think they're like being nice to me, or I don't know, but they said that they understood it as like kind of like a washing machine experience. That you go through a certain period of cleansing, of disconnecting from the your bodily connection, of getting used to the light. I know sometimes when you walk out of darkness into a light room, it's hard to get used to it. That's the stage, but that doesn't last forever. There's a certain stage of getting reoriented, getting oriented to what's going on there, and of cleansing, and then you enter into a state of like the more divine bliss and what we would call as the world of souls or heaven. So there's no such thing as like eternal damnation. There are texts that talk about for very, very evil people there is something like that, but for the most part that's not the case, and that's another part that might distinguish between Judaism and other religions, that we don't believe that lasts for eternity. After that, then you have what's called the world of souls, which is a place where the soul goes, and there it's kind of like experiencing all the spiritual good that they did in this world. They're able to experience that in the next world. So it's an important piece. The way I was taught it is that it's not that like you get to heaven and it's like, okay, what did you do good? Here's your candy. I'm going to give you. You did all this thing. Here's your rewards. It's not that. It's an extension. The next world is called the world to come. It's really coming and emerging from this world. Where we are spiritually in this world, that's how we're going to experience the next world. And so it's not reward. It's not necessarily a reward and punishment. Like when you get there, God's standing in heaven and saying, "Oh, so in 1982 when you were." It's not necessarily that. It's more like it's an extension of where you were in this world. That's how you're going to experience what's going on in the next world. So those are some that's really a short version of a really long discussion. But I just wanted to. I guess the points I think are important is that Judaism does hold that there is a heaven and hell, and there's discussions of what's going to happen in the end of days, which it's a whole other class. Okay, end of days. There's lots of discussion on that, and then there's there's no pitch for Halos, but rather it's sort of like a spiritual experience, and the pain of hell could be due to someone being overly engaged in themselves and in their body and feeling that disconnect when they get there and feeling disoriented from what they were used to. And that's why we're so careful. One extra piece. That's why we're so careful. Jewish law is very careful with the body after it dies. according to traditional Jewish law, we don't do autopsies unless you need to for medical purposes or whatever. But that's like you're forced to do it medically. But we don't do it. It's because one of the reasons is because the soul is so connected to the body once the body dies, because you're so used to being in the body, right? I don't know if you ever got a new. Remember when you transitioned from your old phone to a smartphone? Maybe some of you haven't, but we won't uncloset you right now. But when you transition from your old phone to a smartphone, it's like, what the heck's going on? Like, I don't click on any buttons. I don't push that button 3 times for every letter. You remember that? Anyway, so it's like you're disoriented, right? And it's very different. But the idea is like you were so used to living in a body. Now you're without a body. You don't know what's going on. And if you were very connected to your old phone, the flip phones, you're very connected that you thought that was like really cool. You're going to feel really, really uncomfortable, and you might not even want to take on the new smartphone. So it's kind of like that would be an example of a way to understand it. We're already like a little over time, so maybe beginning of next class, I'll talk about my journey with the afterlife in a short manner.
Can the soul go into another body?
Yeah, so that's for next class too. Right. If you have any experiences with that, share that next week. All right, thanks guys. If you want to hang out and ask any questions, I'm here for like next 20 minutes. And if you have any questions, you can shoot me an email throughout the week. I'll forward you tomorrow some of the material from this class.